Now, over the last year, more than 800,000 Somalis have been displaced due to drought and famine. Humanitarian aid organizations are struggling to cope with thousands of new arrivals in a difficult operating environment in cities like Mogadishu and Baidoa. Now, for more insight into the situation in Somalia's IDP camps, I'm joined here in the studio by Mark Yarnell. Mark is a senior advocate with Refugees International. Mark, you're very welcome to Africa 54.
Thanks for having me.
Now, Mark, you just recently returned to Washington from Mogadishu and Baidoa. How dire is the humanitarian situation in Somalia?
Right, so I was in Somalia in July, visiting both Mogadishu and Baidoa, and those are the areas that have received the largest numbers of Somalis who have fled from rural areas into cities. And just to say at the outset, it's obviously a bit jarring to go from the coverage in Houston to now this other situation in Somalia, but I think it just hits home that no matter where we live, we're vulnerable to these major climate disasters. And in the case of Somalia, it was a series of multiple rains that failed. And so people whose livelihoods depended on farming, on pastoralism, their animals started dying, their lands dried up, and they had no choice but to flee from these rural areas into cities to seek international assistance.
So can you describe to us the situation in the camps where you visited?
So I visited numerous camps throughout Mogadishu and Baidoa, and it's not an understatement to say that the conditions are devastating. Many people who have arrived, they've not yet received any assistance, and they usually use whatever material they brought with them, their clothes, sheets, to construct makeshift shelters. The camps, the sites are very squished together. There's in many cases no latrines, lack of access to water, and that's part of the reason why earlier this year there was a major cholera outbreak that ripped through some of these communities because the conditions in the sites were so poor.
How do you describe the role of the international community in trying to help those folks there? And also, how is the Somali government coping with this?
I think it's really important to highlight that at the onset of this crisis there was a robust injection of funds from donor governments, a scale up by the UN, international agencies, and also the local Somali government at the national and federal level is partnering very closely with these agencies to respond. So we do want to give credit to both the international community and the Somali government for staving off what could have been a much worse disaster. The problem is the most recent rains also failed, and so the drought persists and the crisis is worsening. So we really need to keep the gas on the pedal, or the pedal on the gas, excuse me.
Sure. But how effective has this help been when you look at what you witnessed on the ground? Because I'm kind of curious to see whether most people are even able to return to their homes at some point.
Right, and I mean, in the immediate term, it certainly saved lives. Part of the longer term problem, though, is that for many who are farmers or pastoralists, all of their assets were wiped out. And for a number of families we spoke with, they said to us they lost their camels, they lost their goats, they gave up their farmland, and they say they may never be able to return home. And so that's when you multiply that by tens, if not hundreds of thousands, you have whole communities whose livelihoods are wiped out, and now people who had been living in rural areas are now going to be likely in the cities in the permanent term.
Now, you talked about climate change and how this is affecting, desertification, and there are so many frequent droughts, especially in the Horn of Africa, affecting people's way of life. Are these predictable, and is there anything that can be done to cope with the drought seasons when they come?
Right, and that's what we're seeing as a result of climate change, more frequent droughts, so that communities that previously would have multiple years to restock their livestock, that's not happening anymore. And so there are programs to try to work with farmers, work with pastoralists to try to make them more resilient to climate change. But unfortunately, the climate is changing so quickly and droughts are happening at such a pace. At the same time, we also have to just accept that there will be a very large urbanized community, and how can we help people who can no longer work as farmers or pastoralists integrate into cities and find jobs in cities?
Mm-hmm. And in terms of health, what were their biggest concerns and needs?
Oh, there were many. I mean, the biggest issue was just because of lack of access to clean drinking water and lack of access to latrines, many people were becoming sick from waterborne diseases. So in terms of immediate interventions, that's the priority right now.
Mark, thank you very much for keeping this up to date, because we don't want it to become another forgotten crisis.
You're exactly right. Thank you so much for covering this.
Mark Yarnell is a senior advocate with Refugees International.